Hello everyone, my name is Dr. J Smart, and this video is just going to be a quick writing guide just to help some ideas about the writing process in general, and particularly for psychology majors about how to approach the research paper, which is one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing in our field. So the first thing I want to do is really kind of reshape the way that we think about writing and sort of hopefully take some of the edge off this as a scary process or a process that is arduous to learn. It does take time, it does take effort, but it is something that we can all do. And so what I like to do is start with some principles that might help reframe this idea for you. And as you can see here, there's 4 things that we're going to talk about. 1, that writing is nonlinear. 2, that it is a cognitive activity. It's something that thinking as well as doing. That is a social activity, something people don't often think about. And that 1, that is a continuous activity. It's something that we must continuously sort of work on, and we should. So the first thing is that writing starts messy. It always does, and later becomes organized. So if you're worried about having the perfect opening line or anything like that, don't worry about that. Just sort of get your ideas out in any format. It could be scribbles. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but just start putting ideas out there and then worry about the organization later. That will come with sort of going back and overlooking things. And part of that is because writing just isn't about the mechanics, and it's also about how we think about things and how we process information. And writing can help us only convey that to other people, but also help us organize that stuff for ourselves. So it's kind of this dual goal of both being a way to communicate and a way to improve the way that we deal with information. As a social activity, which most people don't think of, it goes back to our last point, that it is a communication technique. So that communication implies that there's someone that's receiving the information that we're giving out. So it's got kind of an inherent process is that we're writing to an audience. And so in some way you have to sort of take their viewpoint in mind. And it's also an explicit process in that, particularly in psychology, we're often working with other people and writing with other people. And so it's not just sharing our ideas, but incorporating their ideas and getting all of that to sound like one voice. So there's a team process that goes along with this. And the other part of that is realizing that you need to meet readers and other writers where they are. And basically the goal of the process is to guide them to where they need to be. If they're reading your argument, you want to guide them through your argument so that they get to the point when you make your predictions or make your case that they understand where that came from. And that is a skill that has to be built up. So this brings us to our last principle, that writing is a continuous activity. And that's simply stating that this is something that develops over time. I think you often hear that people say, I've just always been a great writer, I always have been good at this. In truth, you practice it. It's not inherent for anybody, and you do get better at it. So even if you feel like you can't write, you will be able to as long as you put the work in. So really think about writing as a skill rather than an innate sort of thing that you're bestowed for that. So now that we have some principles, how do we put those into practice? And a couple things here. We're going to start, the main things are starting with conversations, the use of tools that help you collaborate, and sort of how do you break this up and come back together in terms of putting documents together. So the first thing, and this is something that I use in my lab with my students a lot, is we just spend a lot of time talking and generating ideas. Again, it's a messy process. And you can see this here where, a lot of times it starts with notes like this. And those notes become an outline. Those outlines become prose. That prose gets commented on, and then we start the whole cycle again for that. So while we're generating those ideas, there's some themes that you want to sort of talk about. What are we trying to say? Who are we talking to? So again, it's that perspective taking that. What do we think they know, and what do they need to know? And importantly, for anything, you want to be able to indicate why these are the things that need to be addressed or need to be added to the knowledge base. So that just helps guide the conversation part. As you start physically writing, there's a whole bunch of tools that are out there that allow you to collaborate And I am a particular fan of the comment function that's in a lot of word processing applications. And because you can use them in several ways. You can use them as a storyboard to sort of give you the running outline of the thing. So you can basically incorporate your outline as comments in your text. And so that if you notice that something's missing or there's a leap in logic somewhere by reading the comments, you know that's something that has to be put into the main text. You can also use them as notes or reminders to talk to someone or to add a concept or put a reference in, kind of standard things to do. You can also use it to indicate collaboration and accountability and making sure that everyone has a chance to collaborate by doing things like using multiple colors or multiple fonts. And one process that we engaged in is that we would leave things in color until we all agreed that this is something we all like. And then we would turn that to the base color, which is usually black text. So that gives us an indication of what's done. And the color tells us what we still need to work on. So again, it lets you sort of keep a running process in these documents. So a fan of the shared document. It seems to work really well. But you don't have to do everything together. I think there are points when you can go on your own and then come back together. And in fact, you have to do that. It's an iterative process where you sort of look at it by yourself, see what you think, process it, come back to the group, process it together, come back out. And it's this ebb and flow kind of process. I'm a really big fan of reading aloud because cognitively we know that when you're reading, you tend to fill in gaps. If you can kind of predict what's going to happen next, you'll put words in that aren't actually on the page. But reading it aloud makes you actually hear what's there. And if it sounds weird when you're reading it out loud, it probably is actually weird on paper. In this time of pandemic and hopefully when we return to normal, I think it still makes sense to meet in person or virtually. And again, read aloud to each other, see if other people catch the things you caught. Assess where you are. So kind of the conversations, where we are now, what's the next steps, what do we have to do? And then you repeat this and then get another set of eyes to look at it. Because sometimes when you're working with a group a lot, you all sort of fill in gaps. So, for instance, in my lab, there's things that we just take for granted because we always talk about them. But if someone else is reading this, it might be a point that they don't understand. So it helps to get that extra set of eyes on that. All right, so those are just some general things in terms of principles and practices that we think that work in general. For those that are interested, particularly in the paper aspect of this, these are just some general guides to putting these sections together. So the key thing with doing a research report is that you're trying to communicate and convince people of a particular thing. The way we set this up, and this is a sort of standard format, is you start with an introduction. Now, you don't typically start with the introduction when you're writing. Introduction is actually one of the later things you develop, but in terms of what people will encounter, they'll encounter this first. So what we want to be able to do in an introduction. The first thing is we want to establish the general problem. And that should be a couple things. One, it should be establishing what the issue is and why should we care. And not just you, but why should other people care? And it also establish what you're going to do or what you're contributing or what your role in all this is. So showing that other people care about this, that it's been studied before, and then a general statement of what needs to be done. You want to do that really early because in this area where there's so much going on and so much information out there, you have to get your point across fairly early. Don't make people hunt for it. In the literature review, which is the kind of the supportive part of your introduction, what you typically are doing two things. Is you're showing what has been done and included by others, so kind of giving a state of the field, but you're also using it to suggest the manipulations that you're going to make. Given that you probably already run their study, you use your literature to help justify the things that you manipulated. So this thing should kind of be foreshadowing what's going to happen towards the end of your introduction. So when people get there, they shouldn't be surprised by what they've come up with. So once you establish the current literature, now you sort of say, okay, what's left? What don't we know? So what are the issues that need to be discovered, resolved? Are you extending things? Are you supporting current things? Or are you contradicting? Are you saying there's a better or different way to do things? And then you suggest the questions that need to be asked. These are the questions that just happen to be the things that you're answering in your study. But you suggest this early on, because again, what you're trying to do is lead people into an argument. The next thing, or the last part, is a research plan. And this is really your rationale for doing the study. You bring this all together and you're telling people now that you have this candidate question, what's your candidate answer? And what you predict will happen based on your manipulation. Now, if you set things up right in your introduction, these last few things should not be a surprise. So if we've been talking about body scale and emotion, your prediction shouldn't be about fruit tasting at the end. So, the predictions should follow from your argument, and that's what people and reviewers are going to look for to make sure that's consistent. So that's our introduction. The next part is really important. It's a nuts and bolts part, but it's really important. The key for this part, and this is the method, is that you want to give people enough detail so that they can repeat your study and hopefully repeat your outcome. If you're vague, it's going to leave room for interpretation. It's going to leave room for data that doesn't support your claim. So you want to make this as close as possible, or detailed as possible, to allow people to replicate your study. So they need to know things about the participants. They need to know things about the materials. And really, you include anything that's relevant for the study. So that can include the environment that you're in. Importantly, in the procedure, walk people from the beginning, from when the person walks in the door, to what happens at the end. And the example I always use is, like, say you're in a recipe and you mix everything up and it says put it in the oven, and then the recipe ends. Well, what do we do? Is it still in the oven? How long do we leave it there for? You just let it burn up? Same thing with participants. Are they still sitting in the lab waiting to be dismissed? What do you do? Walk people through the entire process. And the more detail you can provide here, the better. Once we have our data, we have to kind of be able to show that what we found has meaning. So I like to do two things for the results section. The first thing is to have an intro paragraph in there where I talk about what my data actually are and how I'm going to analyze them. So just sort of a preamble about what's the actual process of dealing with this data. And again, the idea of doing this is so that people can follow what you did and repeat it if necessary. The next part is now telling people what you actually found. And in this part, it's not interpretation. It's literally just reporting what you found. And there's basically some key parts. You need to talk about whether it was significant or not. Describe what those differences are, whether they're significant or not, or whether they're significant. And then be able to translate it. Tell me in everyday or lay terms what this difference actually is telling us. And then if you have figures or tables, point people to those to help you bolster your argument or help them get a good picture of what you're finding here. At this point, you're not interpreting. Although there are some journal formats that do mix results and discussion, at this point, you're not saying why or what the implications are. You're just saying what. Finally, the discussion. And it really has two parts to it, a summary and kind of a next step. Your summary is basically, it's a recap of your results and whether those results support or can contradict past research, and then whether they support or contradict your own predictions. So if it doesn't support your predictions, that is okay. You just need to talk about what the implications of that. If it's not significant, it's okay. You just need to talk about what things are could be changed if you think this is a real effect. If it is significant, that's fantastic. Talk about what this means. What does this tell us? What does this mean for the next steps, which are in here? What do we need to do now that we have this knowledge? Where do we go from here? And then finally, you should always leave people with a conclusion or a take-home message. What should people remember from this study or your work? And this is a craft too. You'll probably have to bounce around to figure out, okay, what is the main idea that you want people to walk away with? Because that's important, because that you are trying to communicate a particular argument. So this is just a quick walkthrough of the main sections. And again, you're not gonna be able to do all this right off the bat. This is something that you'll practice and learn through iteration. But hopefully this guide gives you an idea about what kind of things to shoot for in each section. So finally, just to leave you a couple of things about writing process in general, sort of again to zoom us back out. One, there's no one size fits all. We all come in with different strengths and needs, and we're going to come into the process at different points, but we can all move forward. And then using principles allows you to be flexible and still meet your goals. It allows you to adapt to the situation. Also remember, you're still learning. This is a continuous process. So your writing that you're doing now is different than what it looked like before. It's going to look different in the future. The practices that you use that work in one paper or one group may not work in another. So you have to be flexible because they're going to be context dependent. And then finally, really focus on the process, getting a process done. Do not worry about the end point or being perfect at the end, because that's hard to do. And we can't know what people are going to want. So you want to sort of get your process down, and that's going to help you make sure you progress. And then finally, be okay with trying different things, be okay with exploring, and definitely be okay with not knowing yet, because that's where the learning takes place. If you feel like you know it all, you can't progress from there. So again, just some quick tips. I hope this has been useful, giving some ideas about how to approach the writing process. And I will see you guys next round. Take care, everyone.